Hey there, I'm Brian, this is Freethinkery, and in this first ever episode of my little sort of video blog show where I talk about stuff, I am going to, in as brief as I can, demolish the concept of absolute morality. So there's two basic kinds of morality. There's the subjective and absolute. The subjective is the kind of morality that we define for ourselves. A penal code of any human definition would be subjective morality. A group has its own morality, and these things change over time. What is considered good one year might be bad the next year, or vice versa. And the flip of that is an absolute morality, which comes from an on-high source. Typically, you're talking about a god, typically like a sort of an Abrahamic god, so Christian, Jewish, Muslim, at least for the purposes of the sort of apologetics I'm responding to. It's from that faith family that accounts for about 4 billion people. A lot of people. Anyway, the notion is that it comes from a god, and the rule set is perfect because, of course, the person it comes from is perfect and just and loving. So obviously anything, by definition, that comes from this person is similarly, loving and just and perfect and can't be improved upon, whereas the subjective morality that we come up with by ourselves is lowly and worse and, Sodom and Gomorrah, Tower of Babel kind of stuff, where it's just, it's self-interested, and it is just, inarguably inferior to an absolute morality. Now, whether that's the case is really a subject for a different discussion, and I would say, of course, what is presented as a subjective morality is going to be better than what is presented as an absolute morality, because one changes in response to things, the environment and everything, and we've morally progressed as a society and as a species over the course of years, whereas the absolute morality kind of sits still. It's just sort of tethered to this spot in time with very minimal changes, mostly interpretive changes. But as I say, that's actually a different argument. Right now I'm just talking about whether you can even say that an absolute morality exists. And I'm going to I'm going to approach it in two basic ways. One is practically, and the other is conceptually. So practically is that even if we had an absolute morality, even if it existed, we couldn't have access to it, so it may as well not exist. Even if you assume, as some people do, that the Bible is itself not only inspired by God, in this case meaning not like inspired by, if I wrote Harry Potter fan fiction, I would be inspired by Harry Potter, but actually like, God's over my shoulder when I write that. If you assume that's not just inspired by, but actually written by God, that if the original authors of the various books of the Bible were actually very specifically, essentially turned into puppets of God for a little while for the purposes of writing down exactly, specifically what he wanted to have written down, we still don't have access to it because we don't have access to the original copy of that. And even if you assume that version 1 of any of the biblical texts were perfect, we don't have those, and before the Gutenberg movable type press, it would require scribes to just by hand write out the entirety of these various books of the Bible. And over time, of course, there are typos, there are errors and omissions, and then intentional changes. I mean, the King James Bible is a very large example of this. And each of those changes would be subjectively made, negating our access to an absolute morality, even if we had one to begin with. So, for example, if I'm transcribing, and they don't even have to be like intentionally huge things, just it's the way we work. We interpret stuff. We have, our brain is a fiction generating machine. We are subjectively observing the world at all times, and we don't have access. I don't have access to an absolute sense of reality. There's so many things going on in front of my face that I just can't see in terms of like electromagnetic frequencies and energy and X-rays and all these things. I can't see them. I have this very weird, very specific, subjective viewpoint on reality. But the example, in terms of getting a subjective versus absolute, in terms of the drift of biblical text, is if I'm writing it down by hand and I get to one word and I write it wrong, that's an issue. But if I'm just looking at it and saying, I feel that's a little harsh, I'm going to very slightly change it to a word that I like, that maybe even sounds not necessarily less harsh, but maybe it sounds to me better or more appropriate for the scenario or more beautiful or what have you. And then the next person reads it, and his reading of that text is based on my very, very slight adulteration of it, and then so on and so on. to the point that we don't have it. Now, we may have 99.9%. I mean, we don't, but like hypothetically we could. We could have this huge percentage, but it still would be a subjective interpretation. So from any practical sense, we just can't. We just cannot have it. Now, of course, a religious and Christian response to this would be, well, who cares? We still have a bunch of stuff that is close. Or some people would say, well, God actually wanted the changes to happen over time, in which case, why did, in which case then you're saying, well, was, that the whole thorny issue where then you're left with God wrongly interpreting, or wrongly inspiring someone 100 years ago to get to the correct point now, which is kind of weird. But then, of course, you then fall back on the hey, it's all part of his plan, so we can't question it, so everything is perfect kind of thing. Which is a little intellectually unsatisfying for me, but again, that's actually a different argument. So we just don't have it. We don't have anything but a subjective stuff. And even if we did, the amount of ink that has been spilled over millennia, just to explain what they think of, what the authors think of as an absolute morality, is astounding. And the variance and the number of people who read parts of the Bible and say, oh, well, the Bible's against, in a very strong way, against homosexuality, when it actually really kind of isn't. It's, there's a lot of nuance there. But the fact that you have to interpret it, and that you can interpret it to suit other situations, means you are interpreting it. I mean, it's kind of an obvious thing, but when you think about it, it means you don't have access to it. Even if it was there, you can't see it as absolute, because you have to subjectively validate that. And generally speaking, is through your own experience, right? I mean, how else are you to do anything? So we can't. So that's one. That's practically, we cannot. And you can say, well, better to start with the morally more superior absolute law than to go willy-nilly off in the reeds with something that is human in origin. But, again, like I say, that's different. The second argument, the second avenue, rather, is the conceptual ability for there even to have anything that could be considered an absolute morality. And because, and this is where it kind of gets a little kind of interesting and kind of fun, because the sort of standard, from what I've seen, argument about what constitutes an absolute morality is that it kind of is the way the world is, right? Like, it's not God going, oh, I think that's a really good idea, but it's like, murder is wrong in these situations. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do that. And the fact that it comes from on high means that it's good. And I've seen many people actually say that the fact that it is external to the person implementing it, in this case us, that makes it absolute. It is not something we have devised ourselves. And the problem with that is so that God comes up with his own sense of moral, which is implicit in that premise. But where does he get that from? Because you're left with kind of two places he gets it from. One, they exist outside of him, in which case is he a slave to them, in which case is he really omnipotent or whatever. But the more probable response to that is that, well, when he created the universe, he created it in a very specific way. He could do whatever he wanted, and he decided that those things were wrong. So that means that from his perspective, there is no absolute moral code, because he subjectively interpreted the way the universe should be based on what he wanted, which means there is no, conceptually, absolute morality. Now, we can say it doesn't really matter. It's basically, it's absolute in the sense that a rule or a series of rules you give to a child is absolute from their perspective. But if you say that, then it means that we do have an absolute sense of morals, because a judge tells me I can't murder someone. That's an absolute, that's an absolute rule. But then it becomes subjective from the very top, and then it kind of negates its ability to be considered absolute, because someone has to make it up. So God makes it up. And so it's just rambly. I don't know if this is going to look any good, but there.